G'day, Keithy here. Thanks for joining me. So a couple of days ago, I asked the question on the chilling with Keithy, and I also put it on a couple of Range Rover forums. That little bearing noise that I had on the old Range Rover that was concerning me. Now I sort of narrowed it down to one of these three: the alternator, the aircon compressor, and also the power steering pump. Now I've got the cover off all the belts and all that now, having a bit more of a look, and I thought, okay, I might just have a bit of a wiggle real quick and see what we got. So I'll turn you around and show you what we've got. Okay, so covers off the fan. I've just removed the viscous fan for now, and I've also taken the cover off above the aircon compressor. So this is your water pump pulley. That'll do it every time, I think. I think we might have found our suspect, so I'm going to take that off, replace the water pump today. It's going to be a very fun journey. Come around and we'll have a look. One trick that you'll learn too, it probably applies to most cars with a belt-driven fan. To get these bolts off your water pump pulley with no belt on there is a little bit hard because the pulley spins. So you need to have the belt on there. Even if you just crack them with the belt on, it makes it easy, and then you can just unscrew them by hand. And they come out quite easily. So leave your belt on, crack that first before you worry about taking the belt off. Alright, so the pulley's off. You can see all the water pump bolts there. There's a tiny little bit of a leak. I'd say that's come out of the back of the bearing on this water pump, and it's just sprayed as the fan's gone around. Every water pump's different on every vehicle. There's no two that are the same, unless they're obviously of the same make and model. Some of the bolts on mine are 10mm, and then some of them, you see the ones on the other side, are 11mm. Really random, but if you do one on this Range Rover, you need 10mm and 11mm to get those bolts off. Now the engine's still hot, so I'm just going to give that a couple of minutes to cool down. It's also good to take off your cap so that you've got a place to vent, so that when you do take all this other stuff off, it's going to let fresh air in to get all of the coolant out when you're trying to drain it and then get your water pump off. You've got to let air come in somewhere, otherwise it sucks things in. Okay, so I've caught the coolant in my bucket, and I've got that bottom hose off, as you can see there, from the little remaining drips. Now you're never going to catch all of it because it's going to spit and spurt. So what I've done is I've just hosed off the ground here on my driveway before I get under there again and get coolant all over me back while I do this. Good little tip there, just give it a quick hose off. It's better than laying in coolant when you're underneath there pulling the water pump off or whatever else. Alrighty, so the water pump is off. I got my 9 bolts off, did a little count. Bit of the gasket stuck to the water pump itself, and you'll notice here that I've got my top hose, or my water pump hose that goes down to the thermostat on this car, still attached up here. Why do I do that? Sometimes these hoses and these clamps can be hard to get at, so what I do is I'll take this hose off and clean him up real quick, and then I'll put it on the new water pump before I insert it. That way the hardest hose to get on is already on when I put the water pump on. Now let's have a look up here. So you can see the old water pump surface. There's no corrosion in there, which is absolutely fantastic because I look after my cooling system. I think the last time I flushed this was about 12 months ago and put new coolant through it. There's a bit of oil in there, so I might chuck some degreaser around the joint real quick before I carry on. But otherwise it's looking really good. Just got to scrape off all of this old gasket material down here before I put the new water pump on. Now I don't use sealant on this. I never have used sealant on my water pump gaskets unless the manufacturer recommends it. Alright, so here's another tip too. My gasket scraper is buggered. It's got a big notch out of it, so it's no good to use anymore. And I obviously got the water pump off now, so I can't just duck up the shops and grab a new gasket scraper. But if you've got yourself a Stanley knife, you can cut off a section of the blade on the Stanley knife, and that makes a perfectly good gasket scraper if you've got to remove old gaskets. Alrighty, so I've got all of the gasket material off there. That's nice and smooth, that water pump surface now. I'm just going to give it another spray down there with the degreaser, all that little oil residue down there, and then it's time to put the new water pump back on. Alright, it's got to be a record here, world's fastest water pump change. So like the old water pump, I actually put the bottom hose onto the water pump before I put it in, and there she is in all her glory. I've nipped up the bolts down there. Now those bolts don't need to be extremely tight. There's so many of them. There's 9 bolts on this Range Rover water pump, so you don't need to do them through the bloody floor. You only need to put a little bit of torque through them, just firm, and they're all good to go. So now I've got to do the process of putting it all back together. I've got to put the pulley on, the belt on, all that kind of stuff. and then fill her up and bleed her out, and I'll show you how I do that. And so the belt and the pulley are on, and I've used my magic 10mm to tighten up the pulley bolts as well, so you can see the bolts run the correct way. Next up, I've got to put the viscous fan back in, and then I can put the hoses back on top and bottom and fill her up and bleed her out. Alright, so I've got the coolant now. I've mixed it up 50-50 as per the instructions on the bottle, and I've got my what's that word? The water, demineralized water, that's the one. So we've got demineralized water, and we've got the coolant in there 50-50. Time to go and top him up without spilling it, maybe, hopefully. If you can top your cooling system up without spilling it, you're a better man than me. Alright, so I've just started it up with the new water pump in. I've topped up the coolant reservoir. I don't mind, it's a little messy. I've left the viscous fan off because it stops things from blowing around when you're doing it, and you want the thing to warm up to be able to bleed it. So what's going to happen here, obviously, I've got the top hose off the radiator here, so that tells me that the radiator's not full because there's nothing coming out of this little hose here. So once the thermostat starts to open and it starts to circulate that coolant around the engine, you'll see that water and coolant, will start coming out the top here. Once it starts coming out as a steady stream, I'll know that the radiator's full. If there's no air in the system, in that part of the system, and then I can begin the bleeding process once I put that little hose back on. So I'm going to get it up to temperature first before it'll start circulating through the motor. Okay, so you can see there's a bit of steam coming out. It's hard to see. A bit of steam coming out of here now. Soon we'll get some dribbles. I need to rev the engine up. See, I'm going to have to burp it now, so to get some engine revs to suck that through the motor. The radiator's still filling up, as you can see there. Still more to go yet to get all of that coolant through the engine block. Okay, you can see it's starting to come out now, and it's a steady stream. There's no bubbles in that, so we'll just slip him on here for now. I can tighten that clamp up later. But the good news is there's now coolant returning, or it will very shortly, return back up to here through that little pipe that I just put back on. There we go. Now what I've got to do is bleed the system by varying the revs like you saw just there, you heard just there. I'll do that a couple of times, let it cool down, because remembering I haven't got a fan on there, I don't want the engine to get too hot. We'll do that 3 times for about maybe 2 or 3 minutes each to get all the bubbles out of the entire engine system. We'll let it cool down, top it up to the cold level, and we're done. All right, so that's the first bleed done, as you saw just there. I've still got the viscous fan off. So now I'm going to put the viscous fan on for bleed number 2 and 3, and then I'll let it set for half an hour or something like that, and make sure the coolant's at the correct level, and top it up and go for a drive. That's about it. So it's quite coincidental that I did that really sideways live feed last night, and then today I've got to do a bloody water pump in it. Rightio, that's good. It means we're good for a few more years, because that old water pump that was on there, I had that on there, I put that on in 2017, so that's 4 years, and then the bearings eventually died in it. That one that I put on there was a Repco branded pump. This one that I've just put on now is an Airtex pump, so we'll see how long we get out of that, but 4 years is pretty good. There's a lot of Ks that I've done in 4 years, so can't complain about that. I'll get this viscous fan back on, and we'll go for bleed number 2 and 3, and we'll be laughing. So you can see how bad this water pump actually was. I'll show you how much play it had, if I can keep it still. Can you see that movement there? That's a couple of millimeters. And the noise wasn't all that bad. Like, it was noticeable, but it wasn't deadly noticeable. Last time I had a water pump go, it was the same thing, except I started getting leaks from the front of it, and it was terribly noisy by then. I actually had to remove the belt fan, the viscous fan, to drive to where I could change it out, which was on a trip, funny enough, so I had to do it in the middle of nowhere. Just lucky that I've done it before. I've got parts and all that kind of stuff, so I can do that kind of thing. It's just nothing to me. I've done it so many times. But they can go very quickly. Like, there was no warning with that. There were no different driving conditions. It was all just normal. And it's not even corroded. You can look at it here, and it looks to be in really good condition still. You know, all the blades on the fan and everything. So it was actually a bearing inside the water pump that let go first. Very strange. But anyway, that is water pump life. Alrighty, so I've done the second bleed. I've obviously got the fan and all the covers and everything back on here now, just by varying the revs on this and watching in this coolant reservoir here, watching the level, watching for bubbles, all that kind of stuff. Now, if it does start to rise on you when you're doing this, turn the engine off. You don't want to overflow everything everywhere. But I can tell that my radiator's full because we obviously saw the water coming out of that top little hose there. So we put him back on, I've tightened that clamp up, check for leaks underneath. That's a big thing, because otherwise you drive away and you end up spewing out coolant everywhere. The level's pretty well where it needs to be. I'm going to let the car idle for a little bit now. I've burped it a few times with the cap off. If you can't do it, some of them don't like idling with the cap off. If you can't do it, don't worry. Just get it up until it starts to bubble and then turn it off, let it cool down and do your 3 bleeds. And then you should be good to go. And that's it, I'm done now. So all I've got to do is I'm going to let it idle for 5 minutes, just burp a few more times, and I'll let it cool down before I put the cap on, and that way if I need to, I'll top it up prior to putting the cap on. So otherwise, that's it. Thanks for tuning in. We're good to go for another 4 years on that water pump. Don't forget to check out the socials as well, Chilling with Keithy on Facebook and the old Instagram, Keithy_wager, and I'll see you there.